Okay, so let's talk about scoring a thriller. Here is the template I used for that, and I thought that maybe the first thing we need to do is go through that and go through the different sounds that I chose to use here. So basically what we have would be a simple string orchestra with a few percussion instruments and some synths added to that. So very simple when you think about it. You know, we don't have our full orchestral palette, we don't have brass, we don't have woodwinds for this particular cue. And it's probably because in a lot of cases when you're scoring a thriller, you won't go for this bombastic sound or very big sound that maybe an orchestra could provide. And instead, you're going to go for something a little bit more minimal. So here I'm only using strings, and in my string ensemble, I have a harp as well. And this is really going to be the foundation of my piece here, actually. I have a harp ostinato. In terms of percussion, I'm just using a suspended cymbal for transitions, and I have a celeste phrase at the end that we'll hear. Then I have my, my typical string section. What you can see here is that I have patches that are called ADV violins, ADV violas, ADV cellos, etc. It's because I'm using a library called Adventure Strings by Musical Sampling. It's basically a library that's giving you short string articulations, but also allows you to sustain those articulations. So here, my violins, when I play a note, if I play it short, is giving me a short articulation, but if I keep the key pressed down, it's sustaining the note. And what's cool about that is that it's giving me a little bit more versatility when it comes to playing the lines, and I'm really a big advocate of, even if you're dealing with like MIDI programming and things like that, I'm really about playing and performing the lines when it comes to creating orchestral markups. So I really like this library for that, and these are not the only guys who do it that way, but for my short articulations, I prefer to have this type of control. And then I have some legato violins, legato cellos, string sustain, string tremolo, and string pizzicato. So these are a few articulations that I'm using here. Finally here, I have my synth, and I have a piano pad from Spitfire Labs. So Spitfire Labs, it's a series of virtual instruments that you can go and download for free on their website. So that's really good. And they're all really good instruments. They're very simple instruments, but they're really good for different things, and they're really good for cinematic stuff. So here I'm using a piano pad, and it's really good because I can control things like dynamic, and this is really what I like about those libraries, is that they have this philosophy of letting you control how expressive it is with the mod wheel. And this is something that I always want to have in any sound that is sustaining, even like a pad, a synth pad. I want to have direct control over dynamics, and there's different ways you can automate that. You can assign that to a controller with MIDI, but the fact that this library comes with it built in is definitely a plus for me. So here, this piano pad, can be controlled that way with the mod wheel, and I really like that. Second thing I'm doing here, and you'll hear what it sounds like in a minute, I'm using a synth bass created with retro synth in Logic, and I'm using automation in different ways here. I'm actually not using the mod wheel, and what I'm doing here is I've basically used an analog delay pedal from pedal board in Logic, and I've automated a few things here. The first thing I've automated is this repeats control. What you'll notice, if maybe some of you who have played with those pedals, maybe guitar players out there, probably have noticed that when you play around with the amount of repeats in a delay, it creates some weird pitch shifting effects and some weird sustaining effects that you can use really effectively to create cool textures. And here, this is what I did. So what I did is I basically used that to create a texture with my retro synth. What I did is I then automated volume so that we couldn't hear the start of the note I'm playing. So, and I wanted it to increase once I've initiated the movement with the pedal board, and you'll see that in action in a minute. I've started to increase the volume so that this could fade in slowly. Let me solo that so that you can hear what's going on in there. And this is basically, the volume is just automated. So it's going from nothing to minus 30 dBs. It's very quiet because I'm dealing with strings that are quite quiet. So I'm keeping it very quiet. And let's go and have a look at the MIDI data here for this controller. The delay, the time setting is at the 8th note level. Right, so it's creating a really cool effect here, right? So it also has that drive, that kind of eighth note drive to it, because I set the time here at the eighth note level. So it's synced, and this is something you can change in most delays. You can decide to sync that with your metronome. So this is what I'm doing here. That's another one. So I really like that, and I use that to build tension in my track. This is something that you'll want to keep an eye on as we're going to play the whole thing. Later on, I'm using the piano pad in a similar way to kind of increase tension, but this time what's being automated is the mod wheel, giving me this control over the dynamics of the sound. Okay, so let's move on to the actual composition. As you may have noticed here, I wrote something in 5/4. For anything that is kind of tense, you know, that has that element of tension to it, an odd time signature is going to be very effective for that, because this is something that a lot of people are going to have a hard time following. Most people are used to, you know, simple time signatures like 4/4 or 2/4. But as soon as we get into odd time signatures, people start to get lost. And so, you know, this is a good thing. Every time you want to build tension, it's a good thing to use those odd time signatures. And here I'm using 5, and I decided to base my composition on an ostinato. You could call that an ostinato, really, based on this chord that is basically a D minor. If I were to play this on piano here for you, you'd see that it's basically what we would call a D minor add 9 or add 2. And it's really that chord to which we add that note. The second note of the scale, right? And that's giving us this D minor add 9. But here I'm deciding to open up the voicing by playing a root note here, going up to the 5th, going up to the root again, the 9th, and the 3rd. And this is giving me 5 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so I can decide to use that as the main riff in 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I do a repetition of that with a slight shift in the notes. So 1, 2. I believe this is what I did. You could also do something like that. So I'm just changing the order of the notes at the end of that riff. And this is going to be the drive here, the anchor that people are going to be able to follow all throughout the piece. And that's going to be very important as we get into the tense part of our piece, where we're going to explore maybe more difficult harmonies or more complex harmonies. So here, very simple stuff. My harp is playing that ostinato, and then I'm using strings to outline the general tonality of the piece. And the piece is in D minor, and I'm really thinking in a modal way. So I'm thinking what we would say or would call D Aeolian, which corresponds to the natural minor scale. That's the D natural minor scale, right? And the important note in there is going to be that 6th note, the 6th, which needs to be a flat 6, right? Minor 6th. Because maybe when you play in D minor, a lot of people may be used to playing what we call D Dorian, which is all those white keys. But here we specifically want the Aeolian sound, which has a flat 6th in there. The reason why we want this one is because it has a slightly darker sound to it, and I thought this was a sound that was really appropriate for that style. What I'm doing with violins and sustained strings is really things that are going to be outlining notes of that scale, and I'm going to create different motions in there. So let's just take a listen to this first. As you could hear, there's a little bit of movement in there. As I said, I'm just choosing notes from that scale. Most of the time, I will use my ear, I will use my instinct to decide if what I'm doing sounds good or not. For example, here, I start with 2 notes, and I'm creating what we would call contrary motion, maybe if we were thinking about this as counterpoint. I'm starting here with an A and a D, and both of those notes belong to the D minor scale. And then I'm having that D move up. So this would be my violins. This could be my cellos, for example, or violas. I could make the violins move up and make the violas move down. And then go here. Continue that contrary motion. So I would be going up and down in opposite directions here with my 2 instruments. Okay? And this is really what I do. Then later on in the piece, I try to make things a little bit more complex, and I end up outlining what would be considered a G minor triad with the rest of my strings, but the harp is still outlining a general D minor tonality. So eventually the sound we get would be a sound that would be like that. So it would be a G minor with a D in the bass, and that's an interesting sound, you know. Also, since the harp is playing other notes, you know, the full harp pattern is this. You could say that if you play a G minor triad on top of that, all the notes that are resonating are these. So it has that general, slightly tense Aeolian sound. You know, I'm really outlining almost all the notes of the mode here. And this is what's giving us the vibe. And this is really what would be called a modal approach, where you really concentrate on one mode and making that mode resonate. Let's take a listen to this again. The G minor chord appears at bar number 8 here. So let's start at bar 7 and pay attention to what it sounds like in the next bar. So we have that big Aeolian sound here. And then we eventually resolve back to D. Now, into the next section. This is where things start to get interesting. I'm moving the anchor to cellos here, and this is something that is very important to do in terms of orchestration, I would say. Don't be afraid to move your main idea around. You know, you don't have to be stuck to one instrument when it comes to your main melody or your main riff. And here, to give it a little bit more intensity, I'm moving that to the cellos. Also, I'm moving those to cellos on purpose because cellos have a much more flowing quality and a quality that is much different to the one you'd get from harp. Harp has it has a delicate quality, it's a plucky sound, and cellos are a sustaining instrument. They're very flowing, here they're playing legato. It's a completely different vibe that we're getting from that, and it's making the idea, by just moving it to another instrument, it's like making it fresh again, basically. Also, this is allowing us to play that a little bit louder. You know, cellos, we have a big cello ensemble, which is louder than a single harp, and that's going to help with increasing the intensity of the piece. So let's listen to what it sounds like when we go from the harp to the cello. Okay, so a very different sound here, and obviously the volume is increased because cellos are louder, and intensity is increased as well, obviously because we also have new things happening. Just notice the suspended cymbal here to signify the transition. Very useful trick. This is something that I personally sometimes overdo because it's a simple way of just transitioning to another part with new instruments. You know, the suspended cymbal kind of like creates that blur between those two parts, and you can kind of easily fade in and out of two different parts with a suspended cymbal. In an ideal situation, what I would rather do is maybe instead of using a suspended cymbal, try to find ways to work out similar elements between the two sections. so that the transition can seem like they're all very similar and part of the same flow. But here, since there was a lot of different approaches, we had a very sustained strings, a delicate harp, and now we get into a cello with like short articulations on the strings. It just worked well, so I stuck to that. Okay, so let's have a look at the strings. This time, I have violas and violins play short articulations, an eighth note pattern basically, and what I'm gonna do is here, my goal is just to increase tension, so I decided to play clusters, what we would call clusters. Here, I'm starting with those two notes, which are a D and an E, but then I'm going up to that F. So I have this relationship of a semitone between my E and my F note, and obviously this is giving me tension, right? Also, by adding one more note, I'm increasing volume. And then the violins are joining in, playing this time a G note. Since we're going higher, the tension builds up as well. And, I'm also building up through the use of the mod wheel, because those instruments use the mod wheel as well. I'm building up the intensity that way. And finally going up one more note. Okay, so this is what I'm doing here with my short articulations on the strings. I'm also using string pizzicato, to allow me, so this is basses playing pizzicato, to allow me to have like that type of a drive going on, and they're playing every beat here. And this is a really important part of what makes the overall thing feel like it's driving, because without it, this is what it would sound like. So we're definitely missing that oomph that the strings, the basses are giving us. So here, very simple, we're just building tension. Now, we need to release that tension, and what I'm doing is a basic reset, where I'm going to drop the riff on the cello, I'm going to drop the basses, the strings are going to play sustain, and guess what? I'm still trading on this. I'm still trading on creating a cluster with a D note, an E note, and that semitone relationship between the E and the F. So this time strings are sustaining. I'm also adding this D note in the tremolo strings to give us a little bit more interest in the texture. Finally, I'm using a celeste to play a little phrase, and the celeste has this kind of haunting quality to it. It's not only, most people use the celeste for things that are delicate or romantic, but the celeste can be very haunting as well. So this is what I'm using here as my main melody for this final section. So let's listen to this. And to keep the composition coherent, I'm basically playing the same idea. That D going up a fifth, going back to D again, and then outlining this D minor add 9. So this is really what the whole piece is about. It's about, I would say it's about D Aeolian and this chord. Harmonically, it's really about this D minor add 9. So really keep this in mind as you're going through the piece, and as you're looking through maybe the MIDI data and what I've been playing. Always look at it in relationship with this, and in relationship with that mode. And it's really a sound that I like, this minor 9 type of sound, or minor add 9, We really talk about this idea of having the triad and the 9th added, and no 7th in there. Okay, so it's not a D minor 9, it's a D minor add 9, and you will want to keep this in mind as you're getting through the piece. So yeah, that's it for this one. Hope you liked it, and hope you learned a few things from it. I'll see you next time.